What would you do if the person you buried in your heart 20 years ago suddenly appeared right in front of you? Not in a dream, not in an old photograph, but standing only a few feet away, breathing, trembling, and asking you not to say her name. For 20 years, Daniel Brooks believed his wife had died in a devastating wildfire. He rebuilt his life one painful day at a time, raising his son alone while quietly carrying a grief that never truly faded. Then, on what should have been an ordinary afternoon, one impossible encounter shattered everything he thought he knew. Standing beside the woman he had mourned was a young woman with Daniel's unmistakable green eyes and a smile that felt hauntingly familiar. Who was she? Why had Rebecca disappeared without a single word? And what secret could force a loving mother to sacrifice 20 years with the family she never stopped loving? This is more than a story about loss. It's a story about courage, betrayal, forgiveness, and the extraordinary choices ordinary people make when love is placed against impossible odds. If you enjoy emotional family dramas, life-changing mysteries, and inspiring stories about hope surviving even the darkest moments, you're in the right place. Take a deep breath, because sometimes the greatest miracle isn't finding someone you lost. It's discovering the truth that has been waiting for you all along. There are moments that divide a person's life into two chapters, everything before and everything after. For Daniel Brooks, that moment arrived on a quiet Thursday afternoon, hidden beneath the ordinary sounds of a crowded train station. He had no warning that the next few seconds would unravel 20 years of carefully buried memories. If someone had told him that morning he would come face to face with the woman he had mourned for 2 decades, he would have smiled politely and walked away. Some miracles belong only in stories. Real life, he believed, had already taught him that once someone is gone, all that remains are photographs and memories that slowly lose their sharp edges. Or so he thought. The rain had been falling since sunrise, leaving downtown Denver wrapped in a blanket of gray clouds. Commuters hurried across wet sidewalks with their heads lowered against the wind, while travelers filled the station with the familiar rhythm of rolling suitcases, distant announcements, and quiet conversations that blended into a steady hum. Daniel barely noticed any of it. At 54, he had become a man of routines. He restored vintage pickup trucks in a small garage outside Cedar Falls, Colorado, where every dented fender and worn-out engine offered a problem he could actually solve. Machines made sense. Broken families did not. 20 years earlier, a wildfire had swept across a mountain highway with terrifying speed. Rebecca Hale Brooks, his wife, had been driving home that evening. Her vehicle was found days later. Twisted metal, burned beyond recognition. No trace of Rebecca was ever recovered. Investigators eventually closed the case. Friends held a memorial service. The county issued a death certificate. Life moved forward for everyone else. For Daniel, it never truly did. He poured every ounce of himself into raising their 3-year-old son, Lucas. During the day, he rebuilt engines. At night, he learned how to braid hair for school plays, sew Halloween costumes, and answer impossible questions that no child should ever have to ask. Would Mom still recognize me if she came back? Daniel never knew how to answer that one, so he always smiled and said, "She'd recognize your heart before anything else." Years passed. Lucas grew into a successful engineer and moved across the country, calling whenever work allowed. Daniel was proud of the man his son had become. Yet every evening the old house seemed larger than it really was. Rebecca's favorite coffee mug still sat in the back of the kitchen cabinet. He had never found the courage to throw it away. Not because he expected her to return, but because letting go felt too much like forgetting. That afternoon, Daniel had driven into Denver for nothing more exciting than collecting a rare transmission part for a 1969 Ford F-100 waiting in his workshop. The errand should have taken less than an hour. Instead, it changed everything. He stood near the station cafe, warming his hands around a paper cup of black coffee as passengers streamed toward the arriving train. Business travelers, young couples, college students, retired tourists, faces blurred together in an endless tide of strangers. Then the crowd shifted. It wasn't dramatic. just enough for one woman to step into the open. Daniel looked up without thinking. His breath caught instantly. The coffee cup slipped from his fingers, striking the floor with a dull splash that neither of them seemed to hear. The woman stood no more than 30 feet away. Time had touched her gently. Silver strands framed the dark hair he once knew so well. Fine lines rested around her eyes. She carried herself with the quiet caution of someone who had spent years watching every doorway before entering a room. Yet there was no mistaking her. Not the way she tilted her head when she paused. Not the way she folded one hand over the other while waiting. And certainly not the expression that had once convinced a young mechanic he could spend the rest of his life with her. It was Rebecca, the woman the world had buried 20 years ago. Daniel tried to call her name. No sound came. His heart insisted she was real. His mind refused to believe it. Before he could take a single step, another figure appeared beside her. A young woman, perhaps 20 years old. She reached for Rebecca's arm with quiet familiarity, as though protecting someone she deeply loved. Then she turned. Bright green eyes met Daniel's across the station, the same rare shade that stared back at him every morning in his own bathroom mirror. The same warm smile Lucas had inherited as a little boy. For one impossible second, Daniel forgot how to breathe. Rebecca looked directly at him. Fear flickered across her face. Almost imperceptibly, she shook her head. Then, in a voice barely louder than the falling rain outside the station windows, she whispered the words that would shatter everything Daniel believed about his past. "Please, don't say my name." Daniel didn't call out again. He simply watched. Rebecca lowered her eyes for only a heartbeat before gently guiding the young woman toward the station's east exit. She never hurried, yet there was something unmistakable about the way she moved. It wasn't panic. It was caution. The kind of caution that becomes second nature after years of believing every unfamiliar face might recognize you. Daniel remained frozen until the crowd swallowed them. Then instinct took over. Keeping several yards behind, he followed without drawing attention to himself. Rain had grown heavier outside, turning the sidewalks into ribbons of reflected light beneath the city streets. Rebecca never looked directly behind her, but every few steps, her eyes drifted toward storefront windows, using the glass as a mirror to study the people around her. She was checking for someone, or perhaps hiding from someone. That single realization unsettled Daniel more than seeing her alive, because it suggested one impossible truth. Rebecca had not forgotten how to survive. She had been surviving all along. As he walked, memories he had buried years ago returned with startling clarity. Long before the wildfire changed everything, their life had been beautifully ordinary. They rented a modest white farmhouse outside Cedar Falls, where the porch creaked every winter, and the kitchen always smelled of fresh coffee on Saturday mornings. Rebecca never complained about the simple life. In fact, she had chosen it. Born into the influential Hawthorne family, she had grown up surrounded by wealth, private schools, and expectations she never wanted. Her relatives imagined boardrooms and investment portfolios in her future. Rebecca dreamed of something entirely different. She wanted a life built around people rather than profits. Daniel still remembered the afternoon she laughed while painting the old garage door together. One brushstroke across his shirt, one streak of blue paint across her cheek. She had looked at him and smiled. "If we're ever rich," she said, "promise me we won't forget how happy we were before money ever mattered." He promised without hesitation. Years later, he still kept that shirt folded in a box he never opened. Their greatest dream had never been a larger house or expensive vacations. They wanted to transform the empty warehouse beside Daniel's repair shop into a vocational learning center where teenagers could learn practical skills, restore old vehicles, and discover confidence they had never been given elsewhere. Rebecca believed every young person deserved someone willing to see potential before mistakes. She used to say that people weren't broken. Most of them had simply never been given the chance to succeed. That dream disappeared the day the wildfire swept across Miller Pass. Authorities searched for nearly 3 weeks. Rescue helicopters circled the mountains. Volunteer teams combed through burned forests. When nothing was found, Officials quietly changed the wording from missing to presumed deceased. Daniel refused to accept it. Every weekend for months he returned to the mountains carrying photographs, asking strangers if they had seen a woman with gentle green eyes and an easy smile. Most people answered with sympathy, others simply shook their heads. Eventually, even hope became too heavy to carry. Life did not heal him. It taught him how to function despite the pain. He focused entirely on Lucas, school projects, little league games, late-night science fairs, college applications. When Lucas earned an engineering scholarship, Daniel celebrated with genuine pride. Only after his son left for college did he realize how quiet the house had become. Silence had become another member of the family. It sat with him at dinner. It followed him into the garage every morning. It greeted him each night when he locked the front door. Perhaps that was why seeing Rebecca again felt less like a miracle and more like an earthquake. Every carefully balanced piece of the life he had built was suddenly shifting beneath his feet. Ahead of him, Rebecca slowed near a narrow side street lined with older brick buildings. She finally glanced over her shoulder. This time, their eyes met. She didn't look surprised. She looked resigned. For a long moment, neither of them spoke. Then she glanced toward a security camera mounted above the intersection. Her expression tightened. Very softly, without taking another step closer, she said, "If you still trust the man I married, follow me." She paused, scanning the street one last time. But not here. There are too many cameras. Without another explanation, she turned the corner and disappeared into the rain, leaving Daniel standing alone with a question that had haunted him for 20 years and had suddenly become even more impossible. If Rebecca had spent 2 decades hiding, who was she still afraid would find her? Rebecca led Daniel through a maze of narrow streets until the sounds of downtown Denver faded behind them. Neither of them spoke. The young woman walked quietly beside Rebecca, occasionally glancing toward Daniel with the same cautious curiosity he felt toward her. They looked like 3 strangers brought together by coincidence, yet every silent step carried the weight of 2 decades. After several minutes, Rebecca stopped beside an abandoned brick warehouse hidden behind a row of shuttered repair shops. Its windows were covered with weathered plywood. The faded sign above the loading door had long since surrendered its lettering to time. Daniel recognized the place immediately. Years ago, before his restoration business became successful, he had rented the building to store spare engines and old machinery. It had stood empty for nearly a decade. Rebecca looked around one last time before unlocking a rusted side entrance with a small brass key. "You always kept a spare lock here," she said quietly. Daniel stared at her. "I changed it years ago." Rebecca gave the faintest smile. "I know." Inside, the air smelled of dust, aged timber, and machine oil. Thin beams of afternoon light slipped through cracks in the roof, painting long stripes across the concrete floor. The silence felt strangely familiar. Rebecca rested her hand against the back of an old wooden chair but remained standing. The young woman stayed beside her. Daniel closed the door behind them. For several moments, nobody moved. Finally, he broke the silence. "I've spent 20 years believing you were dead." His voice was calm, but exhaustion lingered beneath every word. "I stood beside an empty grave because they told me there was nothing left to bury." Rebecca lowered her eyes. "I know." "No." Daniel shook his head slowly. "You can't know. You weren't there." His words hung in the air. Not angry, simply honest. Rebecca accepted them without protest. "I don't expect you to forgive me," she said. "I wouldn't forgive me either." The young woman looked from one face to the other, as though witnessing a conversation she had imagined hundreds of times but never expected to become real. Rebecca took a slow breath. "There is something you deserve to know before you decide whether to listen to anything else." She turned toward the young woman. "This is Emily." The young woman stepped forward. She offered a nervous smile that disappeared almost immediately. "Hello, Mr. Brooks." Daniel nodded politely. "Hello." She hesitated. "My name is Emily Cross." She pronounced her last name carefully, almost as if it belonged to someone else. I grew up believing my father died before I was born. Daniel felt his heartbeat quicken. Rebecca closed her eyes briefly before continuing. I didn't know I was pregnant when I disappeared. The room became impossibly still. Daniel searched Rebecca's face, waiting for her to say she had misspoken. She never did. I found out only a few weeks later. Every memory Daniel carried suddenly shifted. He remembered the final weeks before the wildfire. Rebecca had complained about feeling unusually tired. She had laughed when he suggested she visit a doctor. Neither of them had imagined there was another life quietly beginning. Daniel looked back at Emily. Her green eyes held his attention first, then the shape of her smile, the way she folded her arms when she felt uncertain, even the tiny crease that appeared between her eyebrows when she was thinking. Small details no stranger should have shared. I didn't come here asking you to believe me, Emily said softly. I know how impossible this sounds. I've spent my entire life believing another story. She swallowed before continuing. My mother only told me the truth 2 weeks ago. Daniel leaned against an old workbench. His legs suddenly felt heavier than they had only moments earlier. If what you're saying is true. His voice faded. Rebecca answered the question he could not finish. Then she is your daughter. No one spoke. Rain tapped gently against the warehouse roof. Somewhere outside, a freight train sounded its distant horn. Emily reached into her jacket and carefully unfolded a faded photograph. It showed a younger Daniel standing beside a freshly restored pickup truck, laughing at something outside the frame. I've carried this picture since I was 12, she admitted. My mother never let me meet you, but she never stopped telling me that somewhere there was a good man who would have loved me if he'd only known I existed. Daniel accepted the photograph with trembling hands. For the first time in 20 years, tears filled his eyes, not because every question had been answered, but because one impossible possibility had suddenly become more frightening than every mystery still waiting to be explained. If Emily truly was his daughter, then someone had stolen far more than his wife. They had stolen an entire lifetime. For several long moments, no one spoke. Daniel sat quietly on the edge of an old workbench, the faded photograph still resting in his hands. Every answer Rebecca had given seemed to create 3 new questions. He looked up at her. You've told me about Emily, he said softly. But you still haven't told me why. Rebecca nodded. I know. She walked toward one of the dusty windows, carefully pulling back a loose curtain just enough to check the empty alley outside. Only after she seemed satisfied did she turn back toward Daniel. The fire wasn't an accident. The words settled heavily inside the warehouse. Daniel frowned. What do you mean? Rebecca drew a slow breath. You remember how I rarely spoke about my family? He nodded. They never approved of us. That was only part of the truth. Rebecca leaned against the wall as though the memories themselves had weight. My grandfather built Hawthorne Capital Group from nothing. People admired him because he believed a company's first responsibility was to its employees. She paused. After he passed away, everything changed. Her uncle, Victor Hawthorne, became chairman of the company. At first, Rebecca believed his promises about modernizing the business, but the numbers never made sense. She had volunteered to review several charitable foundations connected to the company, expecting little more than routine paperwork. Instead, she discovered accounts that should never have existed. Money intended for employee retirement plans had quietly disappeared through a network of shell corporations. The losses stretched back years, millions of dollars, possibly more. I thought it had to be a mistake, Rebecca admitted. So I kept digging. Every document uncovered another. Every answer revealed a larger lie. Eventually, she found financial records carrying forged signatures, including documents bearing her late grandfather's name years after his death. Daniel stared at her. And you confronted Victor? Rebecca slowly shook her head. I never had the chance. 3 days before she planned to meet federal investigators, an unmarked envelope appeared on the front porch of their farmhouse. Inside were photographs, Daniel repairing an engine outside the garage, little Lucas playing in the backyard, Rebecca walking through the grocery store. None of them had noticed anyone watching. No note, no threat. The message was perfectly clear anyway. Someone always knew where they were. I wanted to go straight to the police, Rebecca whispered. But before I could, she closed her eyes. A man came to see me. His name was Nathan Mercer. For years, he had served as head of corporate security for the Hawthorne family. Daniel remembered him only vaguely from their wedding. A quiet man who rarely spoke. Nathan told me Victor wasn't bluffing. He said powerful people had already been paid to erase evidence. He believed there was only one way to keep you and Lucas alive. Daniel already knew the answer before she spoke it aloud. You had to disappear. Rebecca nodded. He said if my death looked real, Victor would stop looking. Daniel stood abruptly. So you agreed? You let us believe you were gone? Pain flashed across Rebecca's face. You think I didn't ask myself that question every day? Tears filled her eyes, but she refused to look away. I was 29 years old. I had a husband I adored, a little boy who still reached for me every morning, and a child I didn't even know I was carrying. She pressed one hand against her chest. I didn't choose between staying and leaving. I chose between losing my family or watching them become targets. Silence returned. Emily quietly stepped closer to her mother. Rebecca continued. The wildfire became the perfect cover. A vehicle matching Rebecca's SUV was pushed onto an abandoned mountain road after the fire spread through the valley. The blaze destroyed nearly everything. Dental records were falsified. Official reports were altered before investigators realized anything was wrong. By the time questions began to surface, Rebecca Hale Brooks had already become a dead woman on paper. Nathan promised she would only need to remain hidden for a few months, long enough for honest investigators to expose Victor's crimes. Months became years, then decades. Nathan continued sending occasional messages confirming Daniel and Lucas were safe. Sometimes he managed to include photographs. Rebecca unfolded a worn envelope from her coat. Inside were faded pictures. Lucas riding a bicycle. Daniel replacing the sign outside the garage. A Christmas tree glowing through the front window of the little farmhouse. I watched your lives through photographs, she whispered. I celebrated birthdays alone. I cried every Christmas. I wrote hundreds of letters. Daniel looked up. Letters? Rebecca smiled sadly. Every one of them. She carried them from town to town, hoping someday it would be safe to send them. But Nathan disappeared before that day ever came. After that, every trusted contact vanished. Every secure address went silent. Rebecca no longer knew who could be trusted, so she kept running. From Colorado to Wyoming, from Wyoming to Idaho. Then farther north under different names, never remaining in one place long enough for anyone to ask too many questions. I wasn't living, she admitted quietly. I was surviving. Daniel listened without interrupting. His anger had not disappeared. Neither had the hurt. But for the first time since seeing Rebecca again, he understood that her absence had not been built on indifference. It had been built on fear. Fear that had stolen 20 years from every one of them. Finally, Daniel asked the question that had lingered since the train station. If all of this happened so long ago, he looked directly into Rebecca's eyes. Why come back now? Rebecca reached into her shoulder bag. Without saying another word, she placed a thick blue folder on the dusty workbench between them. Embossed across its cover was the silver hawk emblem of Hawthorne Capital Group. Daniel stared at it. Somehow, he knew that opening the folder would change far more than his understanding of the past. It would determine whether any of them still had a future. Daniel stared at the blue folder without touching it. The silver hawk embossed on its cover was a symbol he had hoped never to see again. Years earlier, it had represented everything Rebecca wanted to leave behind. Now it had returned, not as a reminder of privilege, but as a warning. Rebecca rested both hands on the workbench. I didn't come back because I finally felt safe, she said quietly. I came back because I ran out of time. Daniel slowly opened the folder. Inside were photocopies of legal documents, handwritten notes, old financial records, and a faded letter bearing the signature of Rebecca's late grandfather. He didn't understand most of what he was reading. Rebecca pointed to a single paragraph highlighted in yellow. My grandfather never trusted that the company would remain honest after he was gone. She paused before continuing. So he created a safeguard. Years before his death, he had transferred a controlling interest in Hawthorne Capital Group into a protected family trust. The arrangement was unusual, but carefully written. If Rebecca died without leaving a direct heir, temporary control would pass to Victor Hawthorne, but only temporarily. A hidden provision stated that if Rebecca or any biological child she left behind was proven alive when that child reached the age of 21, the controlling shares would automatically transfer to them. The transfer would immediately trigger a complete forensic audit of the company's finances. Daniel looked at Emily. "How old are you?" 20, she answered softly. "I turned 21 this Sunday." Rebecca nodded. 4 days from now. The weight of those words settled over the room. For 20 years, Victor had operated the company believing Rebecca was dead and that no heir existed to challenge his authority. If Emily's identity became legally recognized before her birthday, everything would change. The company would no longer belong to Victor. Independent auditors would gain unrestricted access to decades of financial records. Every shell corporation, every forged document, every missing pension dollar, everything would be exposed. Daniel finally understood why Rebecca had returned now. "It isn't only about your family anymore," he said. Rebecca shook her head. "It never really was." She looked toward Emily. "There are thousands of retired workers whose pensions were quietly stolen. They trusted the company for their entire careers. They deserve the truth." Emily remained silent until that moment. "I don't want the company," she admitted. "I've never dreamed about boardrooms or expensive offices." She looked at Daniel. "I just don't want people to keep suffering because everyone stayed afraid." Daniel heard something familiar in her voice. It reminded him of Rebecca 20 years earlier. Not the confidence, the compassion, the belief that ordinary people mattered. He smiled sadly. "You sound exactly like your mother." Emily laughed softly for the first time. "So everyone keeps telling me." Rebecca reached into the folder again. "There is one more problem." She carefully unfolded an aging blueprint. Years before disappearing, Rebecca had hidden the original trust documents. Instead of leaving them in the company's archives, she never trusted Victor. Only one person besides herself knew where the originals had been concealed: Nathan Mercer, the security director who had helped her disappear. When Nathan vanished, Rebecca explained, "I believe the documents had disappeared with him." Daniel frowned. "So how do you know they still exist?" Rebecca removed a small voice recorder from her coat pocket. "It arrived 3 days ago." She pressed play. The recording crackled with static before an older man's voice filled the quiet warehouse. "If you're listening to this, it means I'm no longer alive." Rebecca closed her eyes. Daniel immediately recognized the calm authority in the man's voice. "Nathan," the recording continued, "I couldn't risk telling you sooner. The originals are still safe, exactly where no one would ever think to search." Daniel leaned closer. Nathan spoke one final sentence. "Trust the man who still builds things with his hands." The recording ended. Silence filled the room. Daniel stared at Rebecca. "What does that mean?" She met his eyes. "I think it means you already have them." He blinked. "That's impossible." Rebecca slowly shook her head. "The last gift I gave you before everything happened." Daniel searched his memory. Then, almost instantly, he remembered a handcrafted wooden toolbox. Rebecca had surprised him with it on the day he officially opened Brooks Restoration. He had used it almost every day for 20 years. It still sat in the corner of his workshop, scratched, faded, covered with stains from thousands of repairs. Daniel's pulse quickened. "You think Nathan hid the originals inside it?" "I think," Rebecca answered. "He chose the one place Victor's people would never notice." For a brief moment, hope returned. Not loud, not triumphant, just enough to imagine that 20 years of fear might finally have a purpose. Without another word, the three of them left the warehouse and drove toward Daniel's garage beneath a sky growing darker with evening clouds. Neither Daniel nor Emily spoke during the drive. Every mile carried the same silent question. Had the truth been waiting inside that old toolbox all along? When they finally unlocked the garage, Daniel crossed the familiar concrete floor almost at a run. The toolbox stood exactly where it always had. Dust covered its lid. Its brass hinges reflected the dim workshop lights. Daniel knelt beside it and placed both hands on the worn wood. He took a slow breath, then lifted the lid. His expression changed instantly. The drawers had already been emptied. Someone had searched every compartment. The false bottom had been ripped away, and taped to the inside of the lid was a single sheet of white paper. Across it, written in thick black ink, were 7 chilling words. Some secrets were never meant to survive. No one moved. Daniel kept staring at the message taped inside the toolbox, his hands still resting on the worn wooden lid. 20 years of hope seemed to collapse into a single sentence written by someone who wanted them to believe they had already lost. Emily finally broke the silence. "They were here before us." Rebecca nodded slowly. "Which means Victor knows we're no longer hiding." Daniel closed the toolbox carefully, instead of slamming it shut. For 20 years, he had repaired broken machines by refusing to panic. An engine never revealed its problem to the person who rushed. It rewarded patience. "Who else knew about the toolbox?" he asked. Rebecca thought for a moment. "Only Nathan." A quiet voice answered from the garage doorway. "And one more person." The three of them turned at once. Standing beneath the evening light was an older woman carrying a leather briefcase. "My name is Eleanor Pierce," she said calmly. "I served as your grandfather's legal advisor for almost 30 years. Rebecca stared in disbelief. "I thought you retired." "I did." Eleanor offered a faint smile. "But Nathan made me promise that if anything ever happened to him, I would wait until the right moment." She placed the briefcase on Daniel's workbench. The toolbox was never meant to protect the original documents. Daniel frowned. "Then why hide it?" "Because Victor would assume that was the obvious place to search." She opened the briefcase. Inside rested a sealed envelope, several notarized documents, and an antique leather journal bearing the Hawthorne family crest. Nathan moved everything years ago. Rebecca covered her mouth, tears filling her eyes. He wanted Victor to believe he had already won. Over the next several hours, Eleanor explained every safeguard Nathan had quietly built into the plan. Copies of financial records had been stored with independent attorneys in 3 different states. The original trust agreement had remained untouched inside a private legal archive that could only be opened after Eleanor confirmed both Rebecca's identity and Emily's birth records. Nathan had understood something Victor never did. Power could manipulate people, but it could not erase the truth forever. 3 days later, on the morning of Emily's 21st birthday, Eleanor filed the documents with the federal court. By noon, emergency orders temporarily suspended Victor Hawthorne's authority over Hawthorne Capital Group. Independent investigators entered the company's headquarters before sunset. What followed was not dramatic. There were no shouting matches, no cinematic confessions. Only accountants opening forgotten files, investigators tracing hidden accounts, and years of carefully concealed fraud slowly unfolding through thousands of pages of evidence. The employee pension funds Rebecca had tried to protect decades earlier were finally restored. Victor resigned before formal criminal charges were announced. Within months, he stood before a federal judge answering for fraud, forgery, and financial conspiracy. Justice arrived quietly, exactly as Nathan had hoped. The company offered Rebecca the position of chief executive. She declined without hesitation. "I didn't come back to rule a company," she told the board. "I came back so the people who trusted it could finally receive the honesty they deserved." An independent leadership team was appointed instead, with strict financial oversight and full transparency. Emily accepted her legal role as controlling shareholder, but refused the luxury that suddenly surrounded her. She returned to college the following semester. "I'd rather earn my future," she told Daniel, "than inherit someone else's." Daniel smiled. For the first time, her words no longer sounded like those of a stranger. They sounded like family. Lucas returned home a week later. The reunion with Rebecca was not easy. 20 years of unanswered questions could never disappear in a single afternoon. There were tears, long silences, Conversations that paused because neither of them knew what to say next. Rebecca never asked for immediate forgiveness. She only asked for the opportunity to be present. Lucas finally looked at her and said quietly, "I can't give you back the childhood we lost." He glanced toward Daniel. "But maybe we still have tomorrow." Rebecca cried harder than she had in years. Daniel reached across the table and gently took her hand, not as the husband he had once been, not yet. Simply as the man who understood that healing begins with small decisions repeated over time. Months passed. The old restoration garage remained exactly where it had always stood, but life inside it slowly changed. Unused storage space beside the workshop became classrooms. Old engines became teaching tools. Retired mechanics volunteered their time. Young adults who had never believed in themselves learned welding, woodworking, automotive repair, and practical trades that opened doors to new careers. Rebecca finally watched the dream they had once imagined together become real. They called it the Tomorrow Bridge Skills Center, not because it erased the past, but because it reminded everyone who entered that every bridge exists to carry people forward. Emily spent weekends helping students prepare scholarship applications. Lucas designed engineering workshops for local high schools. Daniel still restored classic trucks, but he smiled more often now. One quiet autumn afternoon, sunlight streamed through the open garage doors while an old pickup waited patiently for its final coat of paint. Emily stood beside Daniel, wiping grease from her hands after unsuccessfully trying to install a carburetor. "I think I'll leave the engines to you," she laughed. Daniel chuckled. Probably a wise decision. She looked at him for a long moment. Then, almost shyly, she spoke the word she had rehearsed countless times but never felt ready to say. "Dad." Daniel didn't answer immediately. He simply looked into the same green eyes that had first stunned him in a crowded train station. Once, they had reminded him of everything he believed he had lost. Now they reminded him of everything life had unexpectedly returned. He wrapped his arm around Emily's shoulder. "I've been waiting a long time to hear that." Across the workshop, Rebecca watched them together. She smiled through quiet tears. Not because the past had been erased. It never would be. 20 years could not be recovered. Old wounds would leave their scars, but scars are not proof that hope has failed. Sometimes they are proof that love endured long enough to heal. As the afternoon light settled across the garage, Daniel looked at the people standing beside him and understood something he had spent half his life searching for. Families are not restored by pretending nothing happened. They are rebuilt by choosing, day after day, to tell the truth, to forgive when possible, and to keep walking toward one another, even after the longest seasons of silence. Time had never returned the years they lost, but it had given them something far greater, a chance to make every remaining year count. Some stories end with justice, others end with forgiveness. This one reminds us that the strongest families aren't the ones that never break apart. They're the ones willing to rebuild, even when the pieces no longer fit the way they once did. Daniel and Rebecca could never recover the 20 years they lost. Lucas could never relive the childhood he spent without his mother. Emily could never erase the questions that shaped her entire life. Yet they chose something far more powerful than pretending the past had never happened. They chose honesty, they chose grace, and they chose to spend the years they still had building something better than what had been taken from them. Their journey reminds us that greed may steal money, fear may steal time, lies may steal precious years, but truth has a remarkable way of finding the light, even after decades in the darkness. If this story touched your heart, let it be more than entertainment. Call the people you love, forgive where you can, protect those who cannot protect themselves, and never underestimate how one act of courage today can change someone else's tomorrow. Because in the end, our greatest legacy is never the wealth we leave behind. It's the lives we choose to lift, the promises we choose to keep, and the love we refuse to surrender. Thank you for sharing this journey. Until next time, remember this. Sometimes, life doesn't give us a second chance to rewrite the past, but it always gives us another chance to write a better future.